I'd like to start off by first thanking you for taking the time out of your day to watch this presentation and to understand a little bit more about a subject that I find very important and that frankly should be important to all of us. And I want to frame it in a story. When any of us began our journey in the field of education, we didn't do it for the money, we didn't do it for the summer vacations, and even if you are one of those people who were like that, you're probably not the person watching this. What we know is that we find passion in our children. We find that they are the most remarkable people that we have ever come across because they can do things that we at their age didn't even imagine. And yet, their stories are sometimes full of hurt, full of trauma. And while many years of research have been spent trying to figure out how to help those types of children, my argument is that there are still those that we are underserving. So I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story of self, a story of us, and a story of now. So let me tell you a little bit about myself and where this all came from. When I joined Stewart Academy at the beginning of the 2016 school year, I was on top of the world. I was full of optimism. I had just come off arguably the best year of my professional career. I had engaged with students at levels that I never even dreamed possible. I had engaged in passion projects with them. I had engaged in project-based learning projects with the students. And I felt that I had a lot to give. So when I joined Stewart Academy as an instructional coach and classroom teacher, I thought that this was not going to be easy, but it would be fun. And then I fell. And I fell really hard. What I noticed as soon as I started with my students is that even with my toolbox that I did have, I wasn't reaching the students in a way that I thought I should. I came from a school whose demographics were very, very similar to Stewart Academies. And yet I wasn't able to reach a lot of these students. And as the year progressed, I became more heartbroken and downtrodden. And I realized that we needed a solution to meet some of the students that, though we were trying our best to meet their needs, we were still underserving them. So I started asking myself some questions. Why, when we have so much, are there so many students who are not successful? Why do the students not feel like Stewart is home enough to honor the school or to at least give school a chance? And as I and the people I worked with wrestled with these issues, we found that Stewart had a unique subset of students that many other schools, while they had, didn't exist in such dense proportion as they did at Stewart. So I want to continue this story by looking at what the research tells us. When we look at what it means to support the whole child, there's a lot of research as to what that means. ASCD, the organization themselves, spend a whole lot of time on this. We know what it means to support the whole child, and while research is ongoing, there's still a vast body of research out there. What about children in poverty? Again, there's a lot of research as to the issues that they face and how to specifically help these children. Stewart has a lot of students who are poor, and we are doing a lot to help them. What about the minority child? Same story. The narrative doesn't change. There are issues that minority children face, and there's a lot of research as to how to help them. We know what this looks like. We know what good educational practices look like for the minority child. But what about this question? For me, when I ask, what does it mean to support the parentless child or a child whose parent is incarcerated, what I started to find is we know a lot less. The narrative changes. The story we try to tell about this child, especially at my school, was a lot darker. What we found is that there was a lot of research as to the problems they face. But as I continued to do research about these types of students, what I found is that there was not nearly as much literature out there as to how to specifically help them. And this, what I came to find, embodied a large proportion of the students in my room. So let me give you a little bit of context. At my school, there are 43 students who are homeless. And while this doesn't seem like a particularly large number, when you look at our total population of around 650 students, 43 students is fairly significant. We see that between male and female, more are male, but the spread is pretty thin. As is predicted, the more students who are homeless are African American than in any other subset. But what really strikes me is the last bullet. We comprise, at my school, 0.7% of total homelessness for JCPS, and it's 10th on the list of middle schools. Now, 10th on the list, again, would seem pretty good, but at my particular school, when we face a whole host of other issues that come with lower socioeconomic status students, the homelessness issue is compounded. In my school, we also have 14% of students who have withdrawn from another school and enrolled at Stewart. This is 6th on the list. What this means for us is we have a high transience rate. This goes back to the why don't students feel at home at Stewart? Because Stewart's not their home. There isn't a sense of school pride when you have 14% of the students in the building coming from another school to enroll. 80.3% of students enroll at Stewart after being at Stewart the year before, and this is the worst return rate in JCPS. So not only do we have a lot of students coming to us from other schools, but once they're with us, almost 20% of our students don't want to be at Stewart and therefore leave. Or they have a home situation due to transience that makes it so that they have to leave. This, again, speaks to Stewart is not home. There's not a sense of pride. And because of that, it's really hard to engage those students. And then we have 153 students who live in Stewart's resides. Basically, we have 153 students that should be coming to my school, but they apply to transfer to another school. And the next highest in the district is 116. Again, this means that for whatever reason, there isn't a sense of school pride and a sense of desire to come to Stewart. All of this comes up to tell one simple story. And that story is, we need to do more at my school to make sure students not only want to come to Stewart, but then stay at Stewart. So as I said before, we know what good pedagogy looks like for a lot of subsets of students. But when we talk about students whose parents are incarcerated, who live with non-parental guardians, or who are in the foster system, we just know a lot less about these kids. As an educator, it is my goal to reach every child every day, and in my school, we talk about how to do this. Yet, as has been articulated up until this point, we're not doing it. And so, if it is our goal to continuously improve, this is an identified need. So I'd like to introduce you to Zone, a small academy that stands for Zealous Opportunities for Novel Experiences. When coming up with the name for this academy, a lot of time was spent trying to pick the right words, because words have meaning, and words have power, and words shape vision. So the vision for us is to create opportunity to make kids fall in love with school again and to want to come to school so that they understand their world better. So the basic idea of the academy, we're talking very small, about 20 students. We want to be very intentional. We want to identify community resources that provide a home when not at school. Basically, we know that a problem with education is that we can control the students' experience when they're with us. We can provide safety and food and structure for them when they're with us. But when they leave us, oftentimes we say that's out of our ability to affect influence. I say that we need to change that paradigm. So we want to go out and purposefully identify community resources for every student that is responsive to that student, to give them a home or to give them structure and safety when they're not at school. We want to use developmentally appropriate practices. Teaching a middle schooler is not the same as teaching a high schooler. And unfortunately, for many educators, the classes they take while in their education prep programs don't spend enough time on developmentally appropriate practices. We want to use 21st century skill-based instruction, so we want to be very computer heavy. We are a one-to-one school. We have Chromebooks for every student. We have various other technologies at our disposal as well. So we want to use that technology to build inquiry, problem, or project-based instruction. And then lastly, I want to go back to the second bullet. And that's what we want to apply the successes of the medical and social work field with a case study approach. Everything I've spoken to you about thus far is not necessarily novel or new. What is new about what we are trying to do is to truly give more than lip service to the idea of kid by kid, need by need. I can think back to my stories my dad tells me. My dad's a nurse, and he can tell me these stories about how he'll be off work for 2 or 3 days, go back to his patient, see the case study or the profile or just the notes from other doctors and nurses, and he knows who and what he's getting when he walks in the door. Why don't we do that with students? Think about a social worker. Social workers will take countless hours to build whole profiles for a person so that you can have a good understanding of who and what that person is. Again, why don't we do that for students? Oftentimes the excuses could be time or personnel or just resources in general. But by creating a small academy where we can refocus some of our existing capital, we can actually use this case study approach and truly be kid by kid, need by need. So I want to return to our story. I've given you the story of myself, and I've kind of given you the context of my school, but I want to talk about us. And I can talk about us as my own school, but I want to go past that. Because the reality is, for me personally, I don't care if you're in the next school over, the next county, the next state. Your students are mine, and through our collective leadership and collective vision, we can help every student nationwide. So across the nation, some schools have more than others, and I know I am extremely fortunate in my school to have all the resources we do. But my question is, are we actually congruent? Are we communicating within the school and outside of the school to make sure that best practices are shared and done? My question is, are we actually reaching every kid, or are we still using a factory model? And most importantly, what is our shared vision? You can have a vision for your school, but if your vision doesn't somewhat mesh with the school next to you or the state next to you, are we actually setting up our students for success at the next level? And so I contend that we need to reallocate our human and material resources to meet more of our students' needs. We need to take big risks and create big changes and use our flexibility and the collective brain power we all have to change our story. We know what our story has been. I say it's time to change the future. So to really understand this, we need to look at the research base. There's a lot of research behind behavioral and academic response to intervention. I'm arguing that we need to have a response to intervention for trauma. Students whose parents are incarcerated, students who live with a non-parental guardian, or who are in the foster system have significant trauma. So I want to lay out some of the issues that affect our children. When we talk about students with incarcerated parents, we see that they have problems with peer relationships. We see that they had 50% of them had school problems such as poor grades or aggression. They face greater risk of ADD and ADHD. If the father is incarcerated, the child's risk of homelessness is dramatically increased. And children whose fathers are incarcerated are much more likely to be held back in elementary school. When speaking about students who are in the foster system, in the Midwest, nearly 37% of previous foster youth repeated a grade. I recognize that this number may change depending on your city, state, or region. However, the lessons learned are the same. No matter where you are, if your student has been in the foster system, they are more likely to have repeated a grade. Also, we see that there are significant mental health issues for foster children, including anxiety and depression. We see that there are high rates of grade retention and lower scores on standardized tests, higher absenteeism, tardiness, truancy, and dropout. We see that students who are in the foster system often repeat a grade, and they're twice as likely as the regular population to drop out before graduation. And at the end of the day, we can see that the students' average level of educational attainment is below other students of comparable age. Lastly, when speaking about students living with non-parental guardians, the first one is probably one of the most important. Teacher and school language can be very alienating for these students, and what we know based on prior research and good pedagogy, if you alienate a student, their engagement drops. Teachers in schools often use the person that a student lives with at home as parents. Yet if you're not living with a parent, this is alienating to a student, thus eroding the potential for a student to become truly engaged. We see there are poorer health outcomes amongst children living with grandparents than if they were living with true parents. Children with no parents present more behavioral problems, and they frequently have socioeconomic disadvantages. So this brings us to our issues and our problems. We know what the research is telling us, and we know the story that has been told, and we know the story that we want to tell. But there's conflict, there's problems, there's a roadblock. And this is where I believe some of the greatest potential from professional learning networks and sharing collective wisdom can be very helpful. First of all, FERPA laws prohibit, in my situation, prohibit us from getting information we need. We can't find out which students are homeless. We can't find out which students are in the foster system. We can get this information anecdotally, but the problem is FERPA says that the only people who can know it are people who are, quote, need to know. I argue as teachers, don't we need to know this? It is helpful for me as a teacher to know which student's living on the street versus which student is living with a grandparent versus a student that has a, quote, normal living experience. It helps me identify the kids' needs, and it helps me reach every child as an individual. This is a problem that really does need to be addressed to allow teachers and allow administrations and districts to have the best information possible. As was articulated before, we need more training on developmentally appropriate practices. At my school, I asked two essential questions. Who do we have in-house, our local experts, if you will, so that we can reallocate their time and their capital to allow them to train everybody else, or to allow them to be a principal actor in this new academy? Also, we need to decide who do we need to bring in? Where are our gaps? What do we still need to know? Do we need to find somebody within district, or do we need to look outside of our district to get further expertise? And lastly, we need to look at a reallocation of resources. For better or for worse, a lot of schools work on a factory model. A teacher teaches, their classes, and that's what they do. And counselors often stick students into those sections. I argue we need to increase our flexibility and think a little bit more outside the box. We need to have case managers. We need to have teachers who are in hybrid positions to really allow them flexibility to meet their students. So I ask questions like, who do we know that could be that case manager? Who do we know that could work in the program? Who do we know that could act as an administrator? Reallocating time, because we already have the money and the resources. What we need to rethink is time. So I've outlined a lot of ideas for you now. We looked at where we've come from. We've looked at the conflicts and the issues that arise. We've looked at the research. I've told you my story and how I got here. So that brings us to now, our call to action. How do we change? So as you're watching this, if you're a teacher or a principal, a counselor, a youth service center coordinator, a mental health counselor, an administrator, a superintendent, what can you contribute to this idea? How can you provide time and flexibility and knowledge to really grow this type of program? At my school, we're looking at teachers working within their team model, but coming off team every so often to ensure that the best teachers work within the program to meet these kids. We are rethinking how much time a teacher takes in a particular section and creating increased flexibility. So our next steps is finding students, number one. As outlined before, FERP was making that very difficult for us. We've anecdotally identified a few kids that we're going to add, but we still need time and we need increased knowledge base to make sure we get what we need. Also, there's an opportunity to add to the body of research. For me, I see this as a tremendous opportunity for Stewart. If this case study approach to an academy is novel and new, our goal is to add to the body of research, not for our own notoriety, but so that it can be replicated, it can be a pilot for other schools, and to allow our collective student population, not just mine, not just the school next to me, not just my district, but nationwide. This is an opportunity to add to the body of research and create opportunity for all students. And as I said, we also want to pilot for future endeavors. If this works for this particular population, why couldn't we in turn adapt it to other populations who are currently underserved? So I really would like to thank you for spending the time watching this today. And please let me know and reach out to me if you have any questions. I would really appreciate any insight or any thoughts you have on the process. And I hope to hear from you all very soon.